If you speak the truth, have a foot in the stirrup.
Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Sea Realm Podcast. I am your host, KMO, and this is episode number 504, Stripmining Idealism, with guest John Michael Greer, prepared for release onto the World Wide Web on Wednesday, May 25th, 2016. In this episode of the podcast, I will continue the conversation that I started with John Michael Greer in the most recent installment of the Sea Realm radio show. Now, it strikes me as unlikely that anybody hearing this would not know that I'm now doing a radio show on Sundays, mostly because I've been posting those shows to the Sea Realm RSS feed. So if you are subscribed to the Sea Realm podcast, you should have received notifications about the radio show episodes without any extra effort on your part. For those of you who did not hear the radio show, I would suggest you check it out. You can find it quite near this listing for the Sea Realm podcast on SeaRealm.com. Sea Realm radio show episodes don't have titles, but if you want to do a search for it on the website, it is Sea Realm Radio episode 004. And normally at the beginning of each podcast, I start by thanking the sponsors, the generous souls who clicked on the PayPal donation link or in some other way contributed materially to my efforts here at the Sea Realm Podcast. I'm going to do that at the end of this episode. And instead, I'm going to do just a little bit of recap from the radio show because unless you read John Michael Greer's blog, the message that he communicated on the radio show is one that would be hard to keep in mind if you've only heard it discussed once. So to recap, he wrote a blog post just before he took his annual or his biannual break from the weekly posts. Every week, every Wednesday, he posts something on the order of 2,000 words to the Archdruid Report, and that's a lot of writing, I know. So he takes the occasional break, but just before he took a break this year, in the spring, he published two posts, one of which was called Donald Trump and the Politics of Resentment, which, while he was on vacation, or at least on hiatus from the blog, he certainly wasn't kicking back and doing nothing. But while he was on hiatus, that post went viral, and in that post, John Michael Greer described the United States as having four primary classes of individuals. He says there are many classes. He himself does not fall into any of the four that he's listing, nor do I, but they are the welfare class, the wage class, the salary class, and the investment class. And we were talking on the radio show about Occupy Wall Street, and I was comparing the Occupy Wall Street narrative to his narrative, and something that he wanted to point out is that the investment class doesn't necessarily mean rich people. There are lots of people who fall into the investment class because they make most of their money off investments, but those investments could be part of a retirement plan. You know, they could be senior citizens who did as they were supposed to do, who saved for retirement and who funded their IRAs or who participated in employer-sponsored savings and investment plans, and they've worked their whole lives, and now they are receiving money every month from their investments, and they are living on that. It doesn't mean that they are rich. But the surprising point that John Michael Greer makes, and it is one that flies directly in the face of the 1% versus the 99% Occupy Wall Street narrative, is that the primary beneficiaries of the outsourcing of labor and the massive influx of cheap labor through illegal immigration, as well as the ongoing pressure from machines and algorithms replacing human workers, all of this puts downward pressure on wages. All of this puts downward pressure on benefits. All of this favors employers and big corporations in their ongoing struggle with labor. If you wanted to put it in Marxist terms, you might say that all of these things contribute to disciplining labor. And that of the four classes, the primary beneficiaries have been not the investment class, but the salary class. And John Michael Greer suggests that the real breakdown is not 1% versus 99%, it's 80% versus 20%. It's the wealthy oligarchs and all of their very well paid, which is to say very well salaried, because none of the people who work and live very well in the the penumbra of the oligarchy, receive a wage. They receive salaries. They might also get generous stock bonuses and year-end bonuses and things like that, but they are definitely in the salary class. And if you were to tell somebody in the salary class, complain to them about the conditions of workers in Chinese factories making iPhones and suggest that iPhones should be made in the United States, well, those salary class folks would object that if we had to pay Americans a living wage in order to make these phones would be a lot more expensive. And I wouldn't be able to get a new one every 2 years. I might have to keep a phone 5 years or more. Or really make a sacrifice to pay for that new phone. Would that be such a terrible thing? So John Michael Greer's point in framing things this way is one that you've heard other people make on this program, and particularly C-Realm Vault subscribers have heard about this. It's that nobody wants to talk about class these days, particularly nobody who is in the ruling class. The sons and daughters of extreme privilege who attend the most prestigious universities, the places where, as I think William Deresiewicz said, students are trained to wield power, not criticize it. In these places, any point of tension, any disagreement, any notion of one group being pitted against another is immediately framed in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity, and never in terms of class. And the point that John made on the radio program was that whenever somebody of extreme privilege wants to frame everything in terms of race, gender, and ethnicity, what they're really doing is making a desperate effort to deflect attention from their own privilege. And I say all this up front because if you haven't heard the radio show, when you hear the conversation that I'm about to play, it sounds as if we go from just sort of idle chit-chat about gardens and whatnot into a discussion of these topics that I was just describing, which seems like the middle of a conversation, which in fact it is. So this conversation does stand on its own, I think, but if you haven't heard the first part, it seems to go from 0 to 60 very quickly. And now one more thing before I play the conversation with John Michael Greer. This is a comment left on the C-Realm website by Leet Minion, somebody who has been listening to and supporting the C-Realm podcast for many years. Leet Minion writes, I'm really enjoying your recent material. I read JMG's posts on the ongoing primary election with great interest, and I think his analysis really gets at some important dynamics underlying what's seeming to be a really significant political realignment. Certainly seems to be more significant than 2008. I'm glad that you're posting the whole C-Realm radio episode and not just the first part. I like having these visits to the archives delivered directly to my podcast app. I could stream it on the Black Sheep site, but it's not as nice an experience as having a podcast feed with downloads. So, a note of explanation. The weekly C-Realm radio show is a 2-hour show. The first hour is new material. So I always put at least the first hour on the C-Realm podcast feed. The second hour is repeat material. Now, sometimes it's a repeat of a C-Realm podcast conversation, and sometimes it's material from elsewhere. Like I've played a Terence McKenna talk from the Psychedelic Salon, and on this most recent weekend's C-Realm radio show, I played a conversation from 2012 from the Psychonautica podcast. If the material that I play in the second hour is not already archived on crealm.com, then I will include both the first and second hours of the radio show in the podcast version of it. But if it is a repeat of a C-Realm podcast episode, which is already in the C-Realm archive, well, I'm not going to have that file duplicated in the archive. I'm not going to have two versions of it. So going forward, if the repeat material in the second hour is something that is already archived on crealm.com, I'm not going to put it up there again. I'm not going to have two instances of a single conversation, both housed on the same server, taking up space. What I will do, though, is that if the second hour of the radio show is a repeat of something that's already archived on crealm.com, I will post a link to the archived material in the show notes for the radio show, which you can find on crealm.com. Okay, that was possibly more convoluted than it needed to be. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, just send me an email. It's kmo@crealm.com. And now here is the conclusion of my most recent conversation with the Archdruid, John Michael Greer.
You're listening to the C-Realm podcast. C stands for consciousness.
That might have been more than a couple minutes.
No, it was. I think it was like 4. It's fine. I had time to get.
Well, I paused by the window and I looked down at my garden and I kind of got stuck there for a bit.
I know the feeling. My study looks out on the garden, and it's always pleasant to look out and watch it, see what's growing.
It is. Oh, I had a question for you about gardening, but it slipped away, but that's all right. It would have been a non sequitur anyway, given what we've been talking about. I've already taken my one detour into, gardening for the conversation. Mm-hmm. So we were talking about the fissure, I guess you could say, within the Democratic Party between people mm-hmm. who are struggling in the wage class and people who are still doing okay in the salary class, and the tensions that arise from that, particularly when it's unacknowledged that there are different classes mm-hmm. vying for influence within, under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier the distaste for any talk about class in the United States mm-hmm. and how it's much easier in the current environment to make arguments based on identity, particularly gender and race and ethnicity, and mm-hmm. To completely discount class. And mm-hmm. This gives rise to a perverse situation where you have the sons and daughters of millionaires at elite universities crying about how victimized they are and basically pointing the finger at people in the wage class and mm-hmm. saying, you're oppressing me.
And yes, and of course that's exactly the point. Typically when affluent liberals talk about racism, when they talk about all the fascism, what they're trying to say is don't look at my privilege. In one of the other blog posts that I wrote in the series that kind of stirred the pot that you mentioned earlier, I talked about the way that every form of social conflict in the United States is defined as one disadvantaged group being oppressed by another disadvantaged group and a bunch of affluent white liberals writing in to save the day.
The rescue game, you call it.
The rescue game. Now, I got that out of psychology. Some of our listeners may have heard of a long, mostly forgotten school of psychology called transactional analysis, and one of the many, which I studied back in the day. And one of the many interesting things that came out of transactional analysis was the analysis of interpersonal relationships as games with rules. And there are functional games. They're games that produce good outcomes for everyone. And in those cases, the rules are explicit. You know what the rules are. You know what the payoffs are. Working for a living is a game. You play by the rules, you get your paycheck. That's your payoff. But there are also dysfunctional games. In dysfunctional games, the rules are covert, and the payoffs, nobody talks about them. The rescue game is one of them. You see it on an interpersonal level. If you've ever encountered the kind of person who is always getting into one crisis after another and turning to someone else and saying, help me. It's always, in many cases they're actually manufacturing one crisis after another, and then they want someone else to help them. And there's this nice little rescue triangle that gets going, where the help. I mean, there are dozens of different ways to play the game, and you have all kinds of fine, dysfunctional outcomes that keep everybody comfortably situated in the state of mind that forms their comfort zone. So, but the same thing happens on the level of society, where we have the rescue game. This is a dysfunctional game. There are three players. There are victims, there are persecutors, and there are rescuers. Okay. Now, victims can only be victimized. Okay. Their only move is to suffer. Persecutors can only persecute. That's the only thing they do. And then rescuers, of course, write in, and their job is, please note, not to change the situation, it's to console the victims and punish the persecutors. Okay? Now, you can watch this in its extreme form at these, the elite universities you mentioned, where the idea is that if somebody is assigned to the class of victim, they can do no wrong. All they do is suffer, and everything they do is simply an outcry from their pain. That's how it's defined. And if somebody's assigned the role of persecutor, everything they do, including apologizing, everything they do is a persecution by definition. And of course, if you're a rescuer, why everything you do is either consoling a victim or administering justly deserved punishment on a persecutor. An enormous amount of nonsense can take place once this game is in place, when the same action performed by each of these three people is redefined in the ways I've just named. And that gives you the basic template for how social problems are analyzed in today's America. One of the crucial things about it, one of the covert rules, the game must continue. Nothing is to be done to actually change the lot of the people who've been assigned the role of victim. Okay? Their job is to suffer. They keep suffering. The rescuers console them, but don't actually help anything. The persecutor, okay. Nothing must be done to change the role of the persecutor. The persecutor cannot be allowed to stop persecuting. And if the persecutor tries, well, any other action he does is defined as persecution. And around it goes. Does it produce social justice? No. But, it produces the warm glow of self-righteous indignation, which is a very popular drug these days. And it also allows the affluent white liberals who assign themselves the roles of rescuer to feel really good about themselves and ignore their own privilege and their own the benefits that come to them directly and indirectly from the various social problems we're discussing.
I've been following this phenomenon fairly closely in the last few months, and I won't say interesting, but a noteworthy feature of what I see going on is that true conservatives are not interested in playing the victimizers in this game. So often the people who get portrayed as victimizers are left-wingers or college professors. They're very liberal people who make some minor linguistic misstep and then get dogpiled upon. Yeah. And go ahead. I can tell you have something to say about that.
Yeah, this is actually one of the problems with the rescue game. One of the reasons it gets difficult is that the persecutors actually have to show up and defend themselves. And if they simply turn their backs and walk away, remember, the game must go on. Therefore, you start looking for persecutors among the rescuers and the victims. And that this is when you get into what I call the circular firing squad phase of the game. And we are deep into that in social justice territory right now. There for the last decade or so, there's been a lot of it in the science fiction fandom community, where people, the excuses that are come up with to label this or that or the other person, a horrible racist or what have you, fill in, one of the evilists, we can say. They show immense creativity, all the creativity you would expect from people who read and write science fiction. Do they have any relation to what's actually going on? And the fact that there are actual, out there open racists in science fiction? Well, no, because the actual open out there racists ignore the social justice community and fight back rather nastily. They're not safe to pick on. So the social justice types pick on their own because they won't fight back.
So it seems like this is a game that, while it must continue, it does switch players. It does reassign roles from time to time. And it seems like the current assignment of roles can't go on much longer.
Well, basically, the ideal is that the game must go on. Any given rescue game will eventually run out of, once it gets into circular firing squad territory, it will eventually run out of persecutors. My guess is that the social justice movement, as we now see it, is in its last decade. And that very likely the political convulsions that are building up around us are going to see a complete reassignment of roles, and possibly a willingness to approach social problems in a way that doesn't involve slapping the rescue game on.
I've had other people say that by not talking about class, but by focusing entirely on gender, ethnicity, and race, that this creates a narrative and an ideology which the business elite can easily subscribe to. It costs them nothing. And
that's very true.
It buys them liberal credibility.
Exactly. As long as you don't talk about class, income differential by class, as long as you don't talk about class barriers, you can look very, very liberal. Why, yes, we're making sure that we have plenty of, women and people of color in our, in our management. They're just carefully picked to make sure that they conform to the class expectations of the people who are doing the picking. And support the class values of the people who are doing the picking. Barack Obama is kind of the supreme example of that. He has, his policies, his behavior in office has been indistinguishable from that of, a basic corporate white neoconservative, and yeah, it's really unfortunate. He could have made a difference.
Barack Obama. He ran in 2008 on a very progressive platform.
He ran one of the most cynical, manipulative campaigns in American history, which is saying something. All vacuous sound bites: hope, change, yes, we can. And yes, as you mentioned, a galaxy of glowing promises, very, very liberal, all of which went into the trash can with the campaign signs. He was going to close Guantanamo. It's still open. It's still full of prisoners who have never been charged with a crime in most cases. He was going to get the U.S. out of Afghanistan. We're still there. All these things he was going to do. He was going to give us health care reform. Well, he managed that, and in the process took the developed world's worst health care system and succeeded in making it even worse than it was. A grandiose giveaway to the pharmaceutical and medical and insurance industries at the expense of ordinary working Americans. I won't say that I had that I had unrealistic hopes for him. I did vote for the man, but he, as I said, he could have made a difference. He didn't. That's really sad.
Well, I have encountered people expressing the opinion that Barack Obama is proof that there's no point in participating in politics, and that Bernie Sanders must be just as callous, just as cynical, and just as bald-faced in his lies as Barack Obama has been.
Mm. And, of course, that's one of the problems that you get when somebody runs that kind of cynical, manipulative campaign. I mean, strip-mining idealism is as damaging as strip-mining the earth. And that's basically what the Obama campaign did. It's very unfortunate. I don't think that generalizing from Barack Obama, was a shallow, cynical manipulator to all politicians are, is a safe generalization, But you've got to moderate your hopes. In particular, no politician is going to make changes that the people who put him into office aren't willing to make in their own lives. Okay. If we want to save the environment, that means that every one of us has to accept less energy, less of the products of energy in our own lives. We must change our lifestyles. There is no other way. And watching people desperately try to squirm away from that by piling messianic hopes on a candidate, or messianic hopes on a technology, or messianic hopes on progress. Something's going to allow us to continue lifestyles that ravage the earth without ravaging the earth. Sooner or later the rubber has to meet the road. Sooner or later, we each have to recognize that it's our own lifestyles that are doing it. And in the same way, in politics, no nation is going to have a political establishment more honest than the people who vote for it. We have a nation of people who happily cheat on their taxes and ignore any law they can get away with, and they wonder why their politicians are corrupt. It really does come down to taking a really good, hard, cold look at ourselves and what we've allowed ourselves to become, what we've allowed our nation to become. And change has to begin there. It has to begin at the grassroots. It has to begin with individuals saying, no, I'm not going to take advantage of this. I'm not going to do this any longer. That's where actual change begins. And then it builds up from there and finally changes the political structure.
We've noted before that the Sanders supporters tend to be younger. Clinton supporters tend to be older and better off. For many of the Sanders supporters, this is their first participation in a presidential election cycle. And the Democratic Party has told them simply, we expect you to vote for our candidate. We know you have concerns that we're not addressing. We don't care. We just need you to vote the way we told you to vote and to shut up.
Exactly.
And that's going to be their primary association with the Democratic Party going forward.
Exactly. And that's why I was saying earlier that the Democratic Party seems to have entered into a kind of into a kind of collective suicide pact, because they're doing everything possible to ensure that the Democratic Party is knocked out of public life for years to come. Even if Hillary Clinton wins this one, they've succeeded in alienating an entire generation of voters. And many of those people are not going to come back. Many of them are very fired up, and there's already talk about the left-wing equivalent of the Tea Party. Basically, young radicals getting together, organizing on their own. The Democrats are scared about that. They have, and of course, express that by denouncing it at the top of their lungs. But we're in the kind of situation where we're literally one plausible demagogue away from the possibility of actual fascism, actual authoritarianism. Because when a democratic system becomes completely unwilling to deal with the concerns of the voters, when it becomes fixated on ramming down its picked candidates and its picked policies down the throats of the voters, that's the atmosphere in which tyrants can flourish.
So we've mentioned there are many who are calling Donald Trump a fascist, largely just because the only game that the Democratic Party can play right now is, well, the Republicans are even worse.
Yeah, exactly. We're not as bad as they are. That's literally the only thing the Clintonists have to say at this point, and it's arguable. But go on.
Well, when somebody says fascist to me, I mean, I think of more than Italy, even though that's the genesis of the term.
Well, hey, at least you think of Italy. Most people say fascist, mean Nazi, and know nothing about either one.
But when I think of fascist, I think of a dictator who gets into office and outlaws the opposing party, executes his political opponents, and makes sure that he never has to step down from that position. Basically eliminating the cycle of elections and the procedure by which the executive is appointed and maintained for a time and then is replaced. And I don't think that there's really anybody who can look themselves in the mirror and say, that's what I believe Donald Trump is going to do, that he's going to execute his political opponents and that he will be president for life.
No, I don't think that's at all likely. And one of the things that has gone very wrong in American political discourse is this habit of using terms like fascist to mean, as I said earlier, I hate you, to use them just as snarl words, and to erase by that process the reality of fascism, what the actual difference between a corrupt, dysfunctional democracy and an actual fascist state. I mean, this is something I face on the blog all the time. I get people whining about how America's fascist. I'm going, okay, how many of your family members have been dragged off to death camps? Because it is really an insult to those people who have actually suffered under real live fascism. For, again, a bunch of privileged white, people to go whining about how society is fascist because it won't do whatever they happen to want. No, the thing is, Donald Trump is not a fascist. There are various. Fascism is not a generic word for authoritarianism. It's not a generic word for the people I don't like getting power. It's not even a generic word for a political system that engages in political leadership that engages in illegal activities and human rights abuse. If that were the case, Barack Obama would be a fascist. What's going on in Guantanamo right now is a violation of the Geneva Convention and a great many laws. Okay? Fascism is a specific phenomenon. I would encourage anyone who thinks they know, who thinks they can use the word freely, to get out there and read some books on Mussolini's Italy. The classic example. Start with that one. Learn what a fascist state actually is. Learn how the ideological aspects of it work. Learn what to watch for. And nobody's doing that. And because nobody's doing that, I'm quite convinced that an actual fascist demagogue, some figure who's charismatic, who's charming, who's honest, who has earned respect in some way, somebody who's busy, come back from Afghanistan with having been decorated twice for bravery, somebody who has earned respect and has that kind of ambition, could seize the center, the abandoned center of the American political discourse, the way Donald Trump is attempting to right now, and use it to catapult himself into a position where elections are abolished, the corrupt former parties are eliminated, and some of their members are never seen again, and we're going to lead the country in a great leap forward to better things, and you understand that we can't let these kind of liberal petty little points like civil rights stand in the way of saving the country. And away we go. I honestly think if we were to get someone like that at this point, a huge number of Americans, including people who think they hate fascism, would rally around it in a second. Because we've got the classic sort of Weimar America situation where we have a failing democracy in which all the parties with a significant grip on power have been saying, no, we know what we're going to do, and your only choice is which version of our bipartisan consensus you're going to support, even if it runs your life, drives your lives into the ground and slams you face first into the gravel.
Well, there's a very cheery note on which to end the political portion of our discussion.
I will say that doesn't have to happen. And there are many other options, and one of the first ones, I would encourage our listeners to find out something about what fascism actually means, so they can stay away from it, and to support actual candidates who back actual change, rather than candidates who are just waving around buzzwords. So go on.
Well, I was going to change the topic of discussion entirely.
By all means.
You have a new book that I'm not sure if anybody can actually lay their hands on it just yet, but it is the Innsmouth book.
Yeah, it is in press. It should be out anytime now. The actual title is The Weird of Hali, Innsmouth. It's the first of a series. And
for those who don't catch it just from the title, it bears some relationship to the writing of H.P. Lovecraft.
It is a fantasia on themes by H.P. Lovecraft, and I think I would probably call it a Lovecraftian epic fantasy. The basic gimmick will be very clear for anyone who reads the back cover, so I won't be giving anything away. The basic gimmick is that the tentacled horrors and subhuman critters and all this kind of stuff that Lovecraft was shuddering about, they're actually the good guys. They've been the good guys all along.
Well, I can't wait to read it, but I would encourage you to continue talking about it in a way that is non-spoilery.
Yeah, well, basically, I read a lot of Lovecraft when I was younger, and enjoyed it a great deal. Despite his kind of flowery prose can get in the way sometimes, but it's an acquired taste. But I acquired it. But the thing that I've noticed all the while is that I don't find Lovecraft's monsters scary. I don't think most people do. Nobody remembers his protagonists. His protagonists are completely forgettable. Everyone remembers Cthulhu, the tentacle-faced, dragon-winged demon god from drowned Uryeh. Everyone remembers, the deep ones in Innsmouth. Everyone remembers the lurker and the threshold, and all of these. This whole invented pantheon of nightmare powers from 6 whole weeks before the dawn of time. They're the ones that get that have all the energy, all the fascination, that had all the focus of Lovecraft's literary talent. It's been pointed out that in some ways his fiction is perhaps the supreme expression of early 20th century white status panic over race. He was a very strong racist. He said a lot of very nasty things, more in his letters and essays than in fiction. But you have to pick your way through his fiction, and you'll be going, ick. He actually said that, tolerably often. But all of his monsters, all of his evil cultists and semi-human, this and that and the other, are all a reflection of a terror of the other. Now, we are talking about a man who is frightened by salad. And I don't share that terror at all. My response to Great Cthulhu rising from the ocean is, wow, that's cool. I mean, I think octopi are cute. so and the thing, I think a lot of other people are attracted to Lovecraft's monsters and horrors precisely because they're not horrible, because they're kind of fun. And so that ended up building up into a sort of critical mass of ideas. And I sat down and wrote the initial draft of Innsmouth in 8 weeks, 70,000 words. I've never written anything at that pace. And it was, it's basically what happens when a grad student at Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts, another of those are more of Lovecraft's inventions, begins to find out that there's actually stuff going on. He's familiar with Lovecraft's work. He's beginning to work on a thesis on rhetorics of otherness in the horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. But gradually this whole hidden world opens up beneath him, and the tentacled horrors are his only hope. And it kind of spins off from there. It was a lot of fun. And there are the second book in that series has been written, is in the hands of the publisher. That is The Weird of Hully, Book 2, Kingsport, another of Lovecraft's fictional towns. The third one, titled Chorazin, which is again another fictional town. That one is in process right now.
Wow! So that seemingly has seized you to do
very much so. I used to back in the day. We're talking here back in the 70s and 80s. I wanted to be a science fiction and fantasy writer, and I wrote a great deal of very bad fiction at that time and tried to get it published and failed. And the bottom started falling out of the science fiction and fantasy market about then. So I ended up redirecting my work into nonfiction. But I retain a great fondness for science fiction and fantasy and for Lovecraftian horror and things like that. It's really a delight to write it again. But also, fiction is a way of talking about things. And it's a very fun way of talking about things. And so there are things going on in this fiction that are by no means entirely distinct from the stuff I talk about on the Archdruid Report. And the tentacled horrors are fun. They're good company.
Now, it sounds like you are responding to Lovecraft in a way, possibly offering some sort of corrective. But are there themes of his that you are picking up and paying homage to without any need to, without any qualifications, basically?
Basically, no. Well, no, there is one. There is one. Except I put it there again. One of Lovecraft's basic notions was the concept he called indifferentism. The recognition that the universe simply doesn't care. The universe is not here for us. It is not concerned with our well-being. It's there. And we're kind of, in the sense that Sartre made famous in some of his existentialist writings, we're kind of flung into this universe and left to figure it out during the brief period that we're alive. Now, to Lovecraft, this was the absolute epitome of soul-searing horror. The realization that the universe doesn't care, that it's not gazing down on us fondly or fiercely, as the case may be. I find the idea of indifferentism an immense relief. I mean, the universe is not breathing down our necks. Here we are. We can, we're basically, freedom is not a scary word to me. And so, but there again, I'm taking this basic concept of indifferentism, but I am very much putting my own spin on it, because all of this pompous nonsense about man, the measure of all things, man, the conqueror of nature, man, blah blah blah. Please, our egos are swollen enough. I'm much more interested in human beings as an interesting species of social primate that happens to be alive on one, not particularly noticeable planet on one middle-range yellow star off to one side of a run-of-the-mill galaxy. Here we are. We can do some things. Let's, have some fun, be creative, and try not to hurt people in the process. It seems to me that getting past the grandiose fantasies of human ultra-importance and accepting a real position in the cosmos is kind of a foundation for basic sanity. But I know there are people who disagree with that. And of course, H.P. Lovecraft was one of them.
I've done a series of programs on the writing and philosophy of Thomas Ligotti. Are you familiar with his writing?
I am somewhat familiar with him. I have actually been avoiding all of the post-Lovecraftian writers from August Derleth on, and soaking myself in the original Weird Tales stuff, primarily Lovecraft, but also especially Clark Ashton Smith. But so I'm familiar with Ligotti. I have read very little of his stuff.
His worldview has been distilled into a nonfiction book called "The Conspiracy Against the Human Race: A Contrivance of Horror." Yeah, and many people who heard the series of podcasts that I did on it were moved to revulsion. They said how terrible, but other people were moved in a different way, and they said, "Yeah, that's a really liberating point of view." His point of view that there is nowhere to go, nothing to do, no one to be, and no one to know. Yourself, your sense of self is a delusion. Your belief in an ongoing self is just this dysfunctional sort of epiphenomenon based on your neurology, but there's nothing to it. And it is kind of liberating.
You see, I would say I have not read the book. The title, frankly, makes me snicker, because I mean, who would be doing the conspiring? If there's no one out there to know, and nothing, where is the conspirator? But setting that aside, my response is, okay, the sense of self is an epiphenomenon. It's still there. An epiphenomenon is a kind of reality. So have fun with it. Why not?
The question of who is the conspirator is an interesting one, because it's not really spelled out in the book explicitly who the conspirator is, although it's the consensus that I've gotten from other people who have read and thought about the material is that the human race is its own conspirator. It conspires against itself. But the fact that, if it is a fact that there is no heavenly scorekeeper and no scorecard and no end of the semester when you get your letter grade for how you did with your life, that's a very different, even if our consciousness is an epiphenomenon, it is a real thing, we can have fun with it. Still, there is no objective measurement by which we should decide whether or not our lives have been worth living. And that's the liberating part.
Yeah, and that's something the existentialists have been saying for a very long time. That's something that Nietzsche pointed out. You choose your scorecard. If you want to have a scorecard, you can have one. A lot of people do. If you don't worry about it. And if the human race is conspiring against itself, the response that I imagine coming from the mouth of, Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, is, well, if that's what you want to do, if that's what entertains you, by all means.
I'm thinking about life and scorecards right now because next month I'm going to drive back to Kansas City, Missouri, which is where I went to high school, for my 30-year anniversary for my high school graduating class. And in terms of the off-the-shelf scoring system that people use for their lives, I have achieved a very, very low score in terms of career, in terms of success of my marriage, which did not succeed in any way.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, yeah.
These things happen.
They do. But I don't know. I don't have to go. Attendance is not mandatory, and in fact, it's going to be it's going to take a sincere effort, because I'm going to drive, from Vermont to Kansas City, Missouri, and back.
Yeah, that's a long route.
Just to go and display my very low scorecard.
My question would be: have you had fun?
I've had a mixture of fun and the antithesis of fun. My life. Okay.
That is to say, you've lived. Okay, I get this. But yeah, the thing is, teachers of spirituality have been pointing this out for a very, very long time. What you achieve in terms of your career, in terms of wealth, all these markers are going to mean diddly squat when, as the French like to say, you're chewing on dandelion roots from the bottom end. Their version of pushing up daisies. That doesn't matter. And I think one of the reasons that a certain class of religion focuses on the heavenly scorekeeper is precisely this desperate attempt to claim that something you do in life does matter in that kind of overwhelming sense, so you can whip people up into the necessary frenzy. One of the things that a lot of the older religions, especially polytheist religions that don't have a single divine scorekeeper, that have lots of gods and goddesses who may each have their own idea of the score, is that life doesn't have to be like that. We don't have to obsessively pursue, a score according to someone else's rules. And if other people insist, well, I think you've had a bad. Your score is way too low because you're not a corporate drone who spends 60 hours a week slaving away to make some jerk in a corner office rich. If somebody has that opinion, well, they have every right to their opinion. It doesn't mean anything.
Well, I'm not telling the whole story, and they're being a little disingenuous in that I say, I have achieved a very low score according to certain metrics, but I'm pretty sure, given the pictures I've seen of my classmates on Facebook, what they look like now, that I will be scoring rather high on some metrics, like
there you go.
Body mass index, amount of hair on head.
Well, no, that in both those cases, that's a score in large part you're handed at birth.
Yes, that's true. Although the body mass index, I do have considerable control over because I've gone to the extremes.
Okay, some people can do that. I know a lot of people whose weight, whether on either end, is very genetic. But it's one of those things. It varies from person to person, and it's again, for seen through the eyes of Cthulhu, does it really matter that much?
He can swallow the soul of a thin person as easily as he can the fat.
Exactly. Yeah. My response is, does he want to swallow souls? Does that interest him at all? Why should it? This is where Lovecraft's indifferentism in some ways needs to be taken a little further than Lovecraft himself did, because, of course, to do horror fiction, you've got to have these horrible things that want to eat you, or what have you, that are actually, they're malign. But if they're malign, they're not indifferent. And to my mind, Lovecraft's best fiction achieved its effects through total indifference, the fact that these things don't care. They don't even notice. When you get something like The Color Out of Space, which is this weird presence that descends from the heavens and happens to destroy biological life in various slow and extremely unpleasant ways, it's not as though it has any malice. It may not even notice what it's doing. It's just, it happens that way. And that's when he gets, the genuine shiver. When it's just this monster looming up before you, oh, well, come on, guy.
Do you have a favorite Lovecraft story?
That varies drastically from time to time.
Or a top three?
My tastes in Lovecraft have mutated so many times. I'm very fond of the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. One of his kind of Lord Dunsany influenced stories. Very fond of that one. I'm very fond of Charles Dexter Ward.
Yes.
Of the others, of course, those are the big ones. I mean, honestly, I wish he'd written novels. He was good at short stories, but when he went to the longer form, those two and At the Mountains of Madness, they're really, really good. He could spin an extended yarn, and I wish he lived. If he had lived into the paperback revolution of the 1950s. The novels, the 30, 40, 50,000 word novels that could have come out of that man's battered old typewriter would have been something to read. But yeah, it is really hard to say, because there are certainly some of them that I really strongly dislike.
There's a lot to dislike, yes.
There's a lot of things to dislike. There's some where he was just clumsy, and there are some where oh my God, it's different for me. Is just laid on so thickly with a trowel that To borrow a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien, disbelief doesn't so much have to be suspended as hanged, drawn, and quartered. The lurking fear is currently my best example there. It makes absolutely no sense unless you're starting with some really, frankly, warped ideas about what human beings are, about evolution and degeneration and all these things that a lot of people in the 1920s and 30s obsessed about, and Lovecraft obsessed about more than most.
Although that seems to be more in his earlier writings. By the time you get to at the Mountain of Madness, or Mountains of Madness, humanity was just a joke to begin with. There was nothing to fall from.
It was one of these. Yeah, it was an accident, just kind of a accidental side effect of the manufacture of Shoggoths. Yeah. Although I forget. I forget her name. She's a modern Lovecraft writer on Lovecraftian things. She has a column. She and another current Lovecraftian writer have been doing these kind of retrospective look-backs of Lovecraft fiction. And she mentioned that her all the way through the latter part of At the Mountains of Madness, she was cheering for the Shoggoths, wondering what their post-colonial literature was like. Because here they were manufactured to be slaves, and they revolted against the elder things, and finally won their freedom. Okay, what's not to like? Shoggoths appear in the Innsmouth book, and they will appear regularly in books to come. I like Shoggoths.
I read a collection of Cthulhu Mythos erotica, which it really, really lends itself to erotica, even though H.P. Lovecraft was constitutionally incapable of writing it.
That's too funny. I mean, I suppose if you're into tentacle porn.
Well, that's the obvious application. Is the tentacle.
That's the obvious application. But no, there are a lot of very powerful erotic subtexts in Lovecraft, and by no means all of them are straightforwardly heterosexual.
What story could somebody go to fish out more on that?
I would start with Hypnos, the Hound, and the Silver Key, and watch the relationships that their main characters have, the very close relationships their main characters have with dear male friends. I don't propose to answer the question as to whether Lovecraft had any repressed proclivities in that particular direction. We will never know, and one does. It's already been debated to death. But in fact, one of the things that I'm going to be doing in a future volume of this series, Randolph Carter, who is a continuing character. Of course, he's in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. He's the main character of the Silver Key. He's the main character of the Statement of Randolph Carter. Also, the Unnameable. He appears. So he's this, and again, he's this character who he has these really close, deep emotional connections to other guys, and not to put too fine a point on it, he sets off my gaydar like nobody's business.
H.P. Lovecraft or Randolph Carter?
Randolph Carter.
Okay.
Not Lovecraft. I honestly wonder, whether the man was basically an asexual.
I cannot speculate.
Exactly. One doesn't know. But Randolph Carter sets off my gaydar big time.
What's the name of the book again? Your first in the series?
The Weird of Hali, weird as in weird Hali, and Innsmouth. If you Google Greer Innsmouth, you'll get it in a bit. It's coming out by a smallish press in Oregon. First coming out in a fine edition, and eventually be out in trade paper. And it should be it's a romp. It's a romp. It's me having a lot, as I say, a fantasia on themes by H.P. Lovecraft, among others. Clark Ashton Smith gets in there rather a bit. Robert Howard, not so much the Conan stuff as some of his other, because he wrote some very nice Cthulhu Mythos stuff that most people don't remember these days. And he was a much better writer than most people remember. Also, the guy was capable, a capable prosmith. Robert Bloch, in his very early days, was a friend of, practically a boy. He was a friend and protege of Lovecraft's. some of the other earlier, Henry Kuttner, I think there's some Kuttner stories, and there's several the sort of Weird Tales stable of authors. And so there's a lot of little nods and homages and so on to concepts and so on that I'm pulling out of the Cthulhu mythos and having fun with.
All right. Well, John Michael Greer, it is always a pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to reading your next blog post, which should be out later today, right?
That's quite correct.
It is finished?
It is done. It is done, and I've actually thought of a couple of minor edits that I'm going to make, but I can make those promptly and go from there. So yeah, it'll be up in a couple of hours.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right. Thank you much.
Thank you.
On the Sea Realm podcast, a mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions.
All right, that was John Michael Greer. The next time you hear him on the Sea Realm podcast, we will be talking about The Weird of Hali, Innsmouth, the first book of 3 in his Lovecraftian high fantasy series. I absolutely cannot wait to read this. All right, now, at the end of the podcast, let me thank the very generous souls who made material contributions of support to the Sea Realm podcast in the past month. They are Boris M., George P., Jim S., and Rob M. So thank you, Boris, George, Jim, and Rob. Thanks also to everybody who subscribes to the Sea Realm Vault podcast. I have noticed that since I have started putting the radio shows on the Sea Realm feed, which is to say, since I've started putting out 5 new free shows a month, in place of the 1 free monthly show that I was doing before I started the radio show, Sea Realm Vault subscriptions have started falling off. The number of Vault subscribers has been pretty consistent for the past couple of years. Every month, some people end their subscriptions and new people create subscriptions. But since I upped the amount of free material that I'm putting out, the people dropping off have exceeded the people coming on. So far, it's not a huge deal. But if the trend continues and my monthly income continues to decline, then I will have to stop putting the radio show on the Sea Realm feed and possibly move it over to the Sea Realm Vault feed. People who want to can still go to the Wool FM website, that's WOOL.FM, sometime within the week after I put out a new show, and find the 2-hour segments that are archived there and download them individually and listen to them individually. It's not a particularly user-friendly process. It's hardly convenient. But the free material will still be available to motivated listeners who just can't afford to subscribe to the Sea Realm Vault podcast. But let's not let it come to that, shall we? If you really enjoy the material that I put out here on the Sea Realm and you want me to continue doing it, then please support that work to whatever degree you can afford to do so. And if you can't afford it at all, I mean, if you really are in desperate straits, if you're in debt, if your monthly expenditures exceed your income, well, then of course, don't exacerbate that by supporting the Sea Realm podcast, at least not financially. There are other things you can do. You can share the material with people. You can post it to Facebook, Twitter, those places. You can write reviews on Stitcher Radio or iTunes. If you're an artist, you can make artwork. In fact, that reminds me, I should also thank Mr. Dead Nettles, who sent me a beautiful hardcover book that he made, which is filled with images of the tarot trump cards. Actually, more than just the trumps. But he has a large format drawings of tarot cards of his own creation in a hardbound book. He also sent a couple of CDs, and he also sent a financial contribution. So thanks again to Mr. Dead Nettles. All right, well, that brings us to the end of this episode of the Sea Realm podcast. I had actually meant to talk a little bit at the end here about the racism of H.P. Lovecraft. I guess I will save that for the Vault podcast this weekend. As JMG put it, Lovecraft articulated the, quote, white status panic about race, close quote. And there is a provocative beginning to a conversation, because it can be a point of real psychological discomfort, the tension between liking H.P. Lovecraft, liking his antiquarianism, his Baroque language, liking his flights of imagination, and his horror at the cosmic indifference of the universe toward the human plight, and his really overt racism, which can't be explained away by him just being a man of his times, because his racism was actually extreme even for his times. It seemed to moderate a bit toward the end of his life, but he was never what you'd call a racial progressive. So I'll talk about that on this weekend's episode of the C-Realm Vault podcast. I know some of you will be joining me for that, and some of you will be waiting for the next radio show, which comes out on Sunday. If the weather is beautiful where you are, like it is here, I would encourage you to get outside. It does wonders for one's state of mind, particularly if one has to disengage from ideological debates on social media in order to get out the door. If that's the case, it's really worth doing. All right, again, that is all for this episode. Take my advice and that of